Okay, well, welcome one and all. My name is Roger Tomlinson. I'm the Director of the Centre for Coastal Management, and welcome to the first of our Coastal Twilight Series, which is an idea we sort of concocted to get some interesting issues about coastal management, coastal engineering, coastal living, coastal everything out to a broader community. And tonight we have two talks, one dealing with storm surge and the other dealing with a topic that's been the topic of three previous talks on our coastal knowledge hub. In coming months we'll be having sessions dealing with beach safety, with RIPS, with shark nets and things that get caught in shark nets and other interesting topics, tourism. A whole range of things are being proposed over the next year or so. The sessions will run roughly every couple of months, so if you're on the current mailing list, you'll certainly be on the next mailing list, and hopefully you can spread the word and make these some interesting sessions. Well, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Joanna Burston, who's Senior Research Fellow in our centre, and she's been working for the last couple of years on a Queensland government-funded project looking at decision-making for emergency management. Thank you, Joanna. I'm just killing that, and hopefully that will make life a bit easier to see.
All good? Okay. So thanks for turning up tonight. This is actually the final seminar for this project. As Roger said, it's been funded by the Queensland State Government over the last 2 years, the primary client being the Queensland Fire and Emergency Services Department. We work in collaboration with the Bureau, and our project partners are also Queensland Cyber Infrastructure Foundation, which is the state supercomputing facility, and DHI Australia. So the objective of this project was to come up with a better decision support system for storm surge events impacting Queensland, and to reduce the real-time pressure on emergency managers in that interpretation process once they receive a warning of an impending cyclone. So the impetus for this project was the events of Cyclone Yasi in February 2011. See the devastation of Tully Heads, just located between Cairns and Townsville in North Queensland. Nobody died during Cyclone Yasi. The advance warning given by the Bureau was really accurate and timely, but a post-event review of the process uncovered quite a lot of confusion amongst disaster managers. And the saving grace of the operation at the time was an extreme degree of conservatism. And the message that I was getting from the department, which was Emergency Management Queensland at the time, was whether the timeliness of the warnings could be improved. So in that event, Cairns-based hospital was evacuated by helicopter, and it wasn't impacted by a storm surge. And the disaster managers would like to know if there was a way that that decision could have been avoided. So this project's involved an extensive project team. I've had a huge cast of rotating research fellows. Some of them are here tonight. Worked in conjunction with Griffith's e-research team, and a variety of in-kind staff contributed by the project partners. So this is the approach that we took to the project, and it's also the outline for my talk tonight, running through the problem definition, understanding the storm surge hazard and the warning systems, and then understanding stakeholders' needs for an improved system, modelling investigations, looking at a range of options through cyclonic wind forcing, hydrodynamics, waves and inundation, and the sensitivities of this modelling in order to come up with a system design. And I'll be presenting our concept design for a decision support system, which is called QSurge. And giving a summary of stakeholder feedback on this system. So just to set the scene, approximately, on average, 3.2 tropical cyclones impacts the Coral Sea per year, and 1.5 on average make landfall. The occurrence of tropical cyclones tends to coincide with a Rossby wave which goes around the equator called the Madden-Julian Oscillation, which comes in 6 to 8 weekly waves. And year to year, the frequency of tropical cyclones might vary due to El Nino and La Nina. So there tends to be almost twice as many cyclones per year in a La Nina year than an El Nino year. And this summer we're heading into an enhanced El Nino. So we can see there from breakdown of the seasonal and latitudinal frequency of cyclones that the Cairns-Townsville area is extremely vulnerable to tropical cyclones, and that's where the high category events tend to impact as well. So the Queensland coastline has vulnerability to storm surge due to a number of factors. It has quite shallow bathymetry within the Great Barrier Reef Lagoon and in the Gulf of Carpentaria, which amplifies the storm surge. The funnel shapes of some of the bays, such as Harvey Bay, Moreton Bay, the area around Townsville, Trinity Inlet at Cairns, enhance the storm surge. Low-lying population centres where some of the houses are barely above highest astronomical tide, especially in South Mackay, Railway Estate in Townsville, and the CBD of Cairns. There's vulnerable communities that might be isolated that need to be evacuated very early because of poor road access, and communities on islands. And then the canal estates of the Sunshine Coast and Gold Coast present quite a different problem. So to run through some historical events that have impacted Queensland, the one I'll be referring to again as my case study event tonight is Tropical Cyclone Yasi. It impacted across Dunk Island and Mission Beach on the 2nd February 2011, producing a surge of 5.3 metres. So this is running, right through the first story of a house and washed houses away, washed them straight off their stumps. Everybody was evacuated from the affected communities, so nobody drowned. But there was an elevated storm surge occurring across probably 300 to 400 kilometres of the state. Cyclone Larry was also a similar intensity event, but it was much smaller in scale. It was a midget cyclone. It impacted in a very similar area and produced a peak surge of 2.32 metres. It also impacted at close to mean tide. So it didn't really have any impact on properties. The impact was contained more on the beach face. Down this way, southeast Queensland still has high exposure to tropical cyclones. Cyclone Dina in 1967 caused inundation of Broadwater of 1.5 metres HAT. There was flooding in Moreton Bay. The water was knee-deep in Hastings Street in Noosa, and we've never seen anything like it since. And you can imagine the amazing degree of development that's occurred on the Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast since 1967. From one of my hometowns of Mackay, the whole town was flooded in 1918 from a marginal Cat 5 event. Mackay has a bit of a protection from storm surge because it has a very high tidal range, but this one impacted it close to high tide and inundated the whole town centre. And there's been some other notable events. The one that gets referred to as a world record storm tide event is Cyclone Mahina in 1899, right up in the north of the state, which caused a surge close to 13 metres apparently. It's been reported in Nature. In the Gulf of Carpentaria, the extremely flat topography means that the storm surge can penetrate up to 100 kilometres inland. Here, the case study there in 1887 in Burketown, the surge was still 7.8 metres above AHG, 25 kilometres inland. And then there's the interesting event of Cyclone Hamish in 2009, which ran parallel down the coast, threatening the coast for over 10 days, and at one stage looked like it was headed straight into Harvey Bay. So that's an interesting wrap-up of historical cyclones in Queensland. And here's just quick definitions of how storm surge develops. It's due to both the inverse barometric effects, where low pressure actually sucks up the ocean surface, and wind set up where the wind forcing is piling water up against the coastline. It combines with the normal up and downs of the astronomical tide to create storm tide. And here I'm splitting out storm tide to be just storm surge and tide, and then considering wave setup separately, because in our modelling we consider the waves and the hydrodynamics separately, even though in the state definitions of storm tide they include wave setup. So it can get a bit more complicated than this. Like these plains aren't exactly flat. The continued extremely strong wind forcing can force the water uphill against gravity as well, which is called a local wind setup effect. So in order to mitigate against the risk that storm tide presents Queensland, there's a extremely complicated range of emergency management arrangements involving federal, state, district and local agencies. We had a workshop of 40 of these people up at the State Disaster Management Centre at Kedron, and they argued pretty much for the whole day about who actually holds the holds the responsibility at the end of the day for calling evacuations. So the warning information passes through the hands of all these people in an event, and there's a timeline given there of how warnings are issued by the Bureau of Meteorology. In the cyclone watch phase, when the cyclone is still hanging offshore, they'll issue a standby bulletin that doesn't contain any quantitative data. And then in the cyclone warning phase, they will issue, firstly, a worst case scenario, and then as the event comes closer, worst case and a most likely scenario to emergency managers. Having a technical look under the hood of how the Bureau creates these storm tide warnings, I sat in on their storm tide forecaster training, and what the forecasters do, you would be shocked, is they draw a consensus track pretty much by hand, match it up to a precast database of parametric cyclones that have been run over a hydrodynamic model, and pick out a scenario that's most similar to the consensus track, and issue point warnings at just 3 discrete locations along the Queensland coastline, and they're delivered to the emergency managers who then match up those point warnings with their contour maps. Okay, and so this process is repeated for every forecast update. They do it for both most likely and worst case scenarios. It's all run manually, like cranked by hand, looking tides up in the paper tide tables. It's all very labour intensive. So still to define our problem of coming up with a concept design for a better storm tide warning system, in the phase 1 of this project, we undertook a stakeholder engagement exercise and surveyed or tried to survey all of the Queensland local coastal councils. This work was done by Dan Ware, who's a PhD candidate in our school, and he managed to capture responses from 19 of the 24 coastal councils. There's a general degree of satisfaction with the Bureau's current system, but then again they pointed out quite a few issues that were uncovered mostly when we delved into lessons learnt from recent events. The primary concern was a lack of information in the early phase of the emergency management process. So when the cyclone is still hanging around, might be 2 or 3 days before it's expected to make landfall, the emergency managers don't at the moment receive any information on the potential impacts of the cyclone. The point warnings don't allow for any visualisation of how the surge might impact the coastline, and it doesn't give them any understanding of the spatial continuity of the process. There's the worst case and most likely scenarios that are churned out by Bureau present quite a large gap in the range of outcomes that are possible, because the most likely track might come nowhere near a particular town and produce no surge at that town, but the worst case for that particular town might be 5 or 6 metres of surge. they're also interested in dynamic timelines. Again and again, it's always expressed confusion about terminology, vertical datums of highest and lowest astronomical tides and AHG. Just the disaster managers never know how to deal with this. There's inconsistent mapping and use of those datums across the different local councils. The councils were concerned about escalating conservatism through the warning process, where everybody involved in the chain was adding on a factor of safety. They expressed that conservatism was something that they wish to avoid because it led to unnecessary evacuations, and eventually felt they would have a boy who cried wolf scenario where people won't leave their homes if they're constantly given false warnings. There was a few knowledge gaps identified with regard to to events such as dam releases coming down the Brisbane River. The coincidence of, say, like the floods in Bundaberg that we had during Cyclone Oswald and the storm surge from that event, and also events such as East Coast lows, but at the moment there's no warnings are given. And also the issue of whether public information on storm tide warnings should be released or not is very topical. Going to get a whole room of people arguing about that one as well. At the moment there's no public release of information. So after all of this problem definition, we've distilled down an objective for our project to put together our pilot decision support system. We wanted specifically to look at what information we could provide at long lead times, make a move from this deterministic system to a probabilistic-based output, improve the spatial continuity and resolution, see if we can improve the process modelling or gain a better scientific understanding of it, and deliver the product as in a form of inundation mapping. So the resources that were made available to us were the high-performance computing facilities of the state supercomputer, Micro 21 software through DHI, and were provided with all the state's LiDAR data, which cost many hundreds of thousands of dollars to collect. Again, looking around at how to start the decision support system, we had an international review, and the US comes out always as leading the pack in terms of hurricane research. The US currently really has a tiered range of storm tide risk products that provide emergency managers with information at different lead times. So at a long lead time, the disaster managers can access a maximum maps, which give the very highest water levels that might occur. It's not storm specific, these maps are precast. And what it does is define the problem space and let you know what areas will definitely stay dry. Moving closer to the event, from 48 to 20 hours, 120 hours before impact, they have a library of products that are called maximum envelope of waters. These are refined down worst case scenarios for the specific storm characteristics that are forming off the coastline. So this model here is built in ADCIRC. And at a shorter time frames, the US delivers a probabilistic-based information product which gives a chance of a certain storm surge height at every location. And it seems to be put together from pre-run simulations. Up until about a week ago, it didn't incorporate the tide, but now it seems to incorporate the tide as well. And these probabilities can be expressed in two different ways. You can get a chance of a surge exceeding a certain threshold, or the magnitude of surge for a given threshold. So these are the type of products that we're starting to look around at. Through our technical investigations, we built a test bed of models, a cyclonic wind model, which is used to force the hydrodynamic storm surge model, which also stimulates tides, and we had a refined version of our hydrodynamic model that included inundation. And we also built a spectral wave model of the whole of Queensland, just for fun. I'm not going to talk too much about waves tonight. It was out of scope, but we did, and I've presented that work at other conferences. And use these models to look into the sensitivities of cyclone forecasting. So we had to start with the types of cyclone track inputs that are currently available operationally from the Bureau of Meteorology. The Bureau runs an extensive suite of atmospheric products that produce gridded wind fields. These aren't appropriate to model storm surge because the resolution of these models is insufficient, and also the track of cyclone is too uncertain to use just a deterministic output. So digging deeper into the Bureau, uncovered a range of track products that they use to determine a wind probability footprinting. It's called a De Maria ensemble. And I reformed that ensemble into nice straight tracks that I've got pictured there, which show the range, the spread of the possibilities where the cyclone might go at different points in the forecast. You can see there that there's a huge swath of Queensland that might be impacted, say, 48 hours before landfall. And each of these tracks has a probability associated with it and a range of characteristics such as intensity, the radius to maximum winds, and the forward speed. So breaking down that example there for Cyclone Yassi, you can see the large uncertainties in the landfall location there, for going from cool to hot colours as the range of the landfall locations contracts in around Mission Beach. And also at the long lead time, there's very little certainty about when the cyclone is going to cross the coast, and even 14 hours before impact, there's a range of landfall times that might be plus or minus 6 hours, like definitely incorporating a high and a low tide. So moving from our cyclone tracks into our cyclone wind field, I used a Holland's 2010 idealised parametrisation of cyclonic wind field. This is very similar to the current way the Bureau models cyclones for storm surge. And we established a Mike 21 hydrodynamic model of the whole of Queensland in a flexible mesh with a resolution of 1 to 2 kilometres generally along the coastline, but getting into very nice fine resolution down in and around the channels and islands in order to capture the areas where the storm surge is amplifying. We calibrated this hydrodynamic model for the port locations and produced a very nice calibration there. And then had validated the model for a range of cyclonic events. You can see here just the key locations where I'm going to show the validation graphs for, where I've got the measured storm surge in blue and the modelled storm surge in red. No, there's the other way. It should be the other way around there. Sorry, the measured one is the more bumpy one, and the modelled one is the blue one that's smooth, sorry. So we're showing that we've captured the peak of the storm surge well. It's not capturing the lead and the lag after the event that well, because the Holland wind field doesn't capture the spiral arms of the cyclone sufficiently. Again, for Cyclone Larry, we've produced a nice validation there. Generally, when there's a bit of negative surge, the model's getting way too much negative surge going on because the wind forcing coming off the land is going too fast. Requires a roughness model for the winds. So here we've got a very nice simulation of Cyclone Yassi coming in. So the vectors are showing the wind speeds, and that's a surface elevation of the surge in there, amplifying behind Hinchinbrook Islands. And we were very nice and good if we could just model the surge like that, but as I said, the uncertainty in the tracks means that a deterministic model like that is really pointless for forecasting. So we had a detailed look in at the sensitivities of the storm surge to the various parameters of the cyclone, and found a high degree of sensitivity to landfall location. Here we've got longshore variability, so there's cyclones hitting the coast at a fixed location and looking at how the surge varies at different points away from that. A lesser degree of sensitivity to forward speed, because there's two processes going on with forward speed. As the cyclone is heading faster towards the coast, the wind speeds are relatively becoming faster, but at the same time the surge has less time to pile up against the coast. And then quite a high degree of sensitivity to the angle of approach to the cyclone due to the complex, bathymetry and the layout of islands. Mean that you really want to have simulations of the surge from a wide range of angles, or from a narrow increment in the angle spacing. We also looked into a sensitivity testing on process inclusion. So looking at whether we wanted to model the storm surge on a dynamic tide or on a static tide. We found that static tide is conservative. Using a static tide was conservative. And it also reduced the ensemble size necessary, because you don't have to start the cyclone off at different times in the tidal phasing. Looking at the dynamics between the storm surge and waves, because very large waves are also produced during the cyclone, we added in the wave radiation stresses and found, of course, the end effect of on the storm surge of the wave radiation stresses is highly model resolution dependent. Found an impact of up to 0.5 metre in isolated locations, but also from an investigation of the field inundation from Cyclone Yazzie found it's probably doubling up with the empirical wave setup estimation anyway. So, and that it's also computationally prohibitive to include wave radiation stresses in simulations. The wave model takes a lot longer to run than the hydrodynamic model. Looking at the effects of opening the land boundary or not having glass walls on the edge of the hydrodynamic model showed that in specific settings, such as the kind of channel in there behind Hinchinbrook Island, that the storm surge will be overestimated with a glass wall boundary. Our next investigation was into the best way to map inundation, whether that should be done using a dynamic inundation model or just using a fairly simple mapping technique. So the options for this were the current method that emergency services use to map inundation. When all they get are these 3-point warnings along the coastline from the Bureau of Meteorology and go, oh, how the hell are we going to map that up against our contour maps? And they just kind of use a very conservative approach and use a flat contour across pretty, hundreds of kilometres. So if there was a predicted surge of 5.5 metres at Cardwell, they're applying 5.5 metres of risk zone between Lucinda and Clump Point. If we have a finer hydrodynamic model, we can yield output at all the little green points there in the top image, and use them to interpolate the inundation inland using a refined bathtub approach. It's not process based. It's not incorporating friction or this local wind setup effects. Or we can go for a full inundation modelling, explicitly modelling the flow of the water over the lands, which does account for more processes, but we don't really have the data sets and the understanding of the friction coefficients necessary to do that sort of modelling. So, looking at these approaches for Cyclone Yazzie, we found that there was an extensive computational advantage in not going down the inundation modelling path and just keeping with this refined bathtub approach, which was generally conservative, except in the face of extreme wind forcing causing local setup. Shown down there in the very bottom image, there's some red areas where the bathtub approach is not conservative. But then again, comparing this refined bathtub approach to the status quo approach, we showed it's definitely reducing down the conservatism that Emergency Management Queensland currently has in its estimations. So in all, from all those investigations, we found that the uncertainty in the cyclone forecast really governs this whole problem space of how to forecast storm tide. this high uncertainty means that we want to maximise ensemble size and the number of cyclones that we're modelling in order to capture the full problem space. To maximise this ensemble size, we need to minimise the run time for each simulation. And we propose to do this using these idealised wind fields in the very simple hydrodynamic model with a static tide without using inundation modelling and neglecting these second-order processes such as the wave coupling. And even so, the ensembles still were fairly large, and we'd really advocate a pre-simulated approach over a real-time modelling approach. So, pulling all that together, we came up with a system design for a storm tide decision support system. It's called QSurge. I got to name it. And it consists of 2 risk products for evaluation by our stakeholders. The first one's a potential envelope product. It contains both of these kind of maximum envelope of water products of NOAAs. It's for use at longer lead times. Unlike the NOAA products, it's a dynamic visualisation where the maps are created on the fly and delivered through a web browser facility. The second product that we have there is for use at shorter lead times. It's just in a concept design stage. It's producing similar sort of output to the NOAA's P-Surge products, but it's giving an inundation mapping presentation of that, and giving storm tide depths at different probability levels. So this is our link. It's on the flyer that's at the back of the room, so you can pick it up and then try out our interface later, because it's lots of fun. So I can just show you that. Works best in either Google Chrome or Firefox. So for our potential envelope tab here, we'd see that the Bureau of Meteorology would supply either the information products that define the cyclone parameters, or it's something that's really hidden behind the scenes and just delivered to, and the end product's just delivered to the emergency managers. You can set the range of angles from which the cyclone is expected to approach, the range of latitudes between which it's expected to hit the coastline, and the expected maximum category of the cyclone. We'll go for a Cat 5, why not? You can then choose the expected tidal plane. It could be a constant mean sea level, or highest astronomical tide, or the maximum high tide expected to occur between 2 dates. The wave setup function is currently not operational. It would, in the current way that the Bureau issues wave setup estimates would just be a flat constant factor added on. I'd love to do something better than that. So it's not instantaneous because it's mining in there a data set of 50,000 cyclones and coming up with, hopefully came up with something, oh my god. It's not good at all. Coming up with the maximum inundation surface expected from those scenarios that it's drawing out of the library. Someone want to tell me why that's not working? Someone from IT? Oh yeah, that did then. So there we go. It's really pretty. It took ages to choose the colours. And it, this is currently at a spatial resolution of 100 metres per grid cell. And it's something can be improved because the underlying LiDAR is at 1 metre. You can see when the storm tide is expected to inundate the Bruce Highway. So I think I've run through there the potential envelope products. So it's backed by this database of 50,000 cyclones with these range of parameters in the background. At the moment, it's just got a fixed forward speed and radius maximum winds, and we'd look to expand that in the future phases of this project. Currently got the tides in there for 2012. The tides are easily updatable. So there's a range of different outputs for a different range of inputs. The maximum envelopes there. Across Cairns, we can see flooding of 6 to 8 metres pretty much across the CBD of Cairns. It's a bit of a scary place to be in the middle of a Cat 5 cyclone. But even in a Cat 3 cyclone, this blue area here is the main area of Cairns. The hospital and all the shops are. Still getting 1 to 2 metres through the main street. So looking at improvements to this product, of what it could do with further development is improving that inundation mapping algorithm based on a precast library of inundation modelling, incorporating the wave setup, extending to shore parallel cyclone tracks, and more explicitly modelling the storm surge and the tide together. We'd like it to be a seamless product that delivers from the Bureau to the end users without kind of even going through this interface. All the users would end up with is a delivery of a KMZ image or a raster file into their GIS system. And for the southern areas of southeastern Queensland, the stakeholders are very interested in having a point outputs to govern hit the tailwater levels for their flood modelling. So what this product doesn't do is give a perfect deterministic forecast. The wind field itself will never match the exact cyclone that's happening out there at sea. Though, as I said, those second order processes are neglected. We can't account for non-cyclonic events or riverine flooding. We're not looking down into the detail of the urban drainage network, coastal defences and erosion. And it's also a good idea to keep an eye on the real-time data of the storm tide monitoring network to see if this event's actually occurring. So the second tab there on our Q-Surge product is called the probabilistic forecast. As I said, it's similar to NOAA's P-Surge products. It incorporates the forecast uncertainty. So all the user has to put in is enters the event, and it should be updated every forecast time step. It explicitly considers the phasing of the tide as the cyclone approaches the coast, and at the moment is generated from real-time modelling, but it could be all drawn from a precast simulated library. And what it outputs, you can see there in the slide at the bottom, is a range of inundation surfaces corresponding to a particular probability of exceedance. And having a view of this uncertainty would enable emergency managers to make structured, risk-based decision-making. They decide they might evacuate the hospital if it has a 1% chance of flooding, they might evacuate a residential area if it has a 10% chance of flooding, and takes a lot of the confusion away from the emergency managers. Backing all this is a bit of a complicated algorithm, turning these ensemble of cyclone tracks and breaking them down into probability distributions of all the different parameters that are important for storm surge, which is the time of landfall, intensity, the radius of maximum winds, also the forward speed, which should have included there, and recasting the ensemble, and then running all those ensembles across the hydrodynamic model, and then ranking the output from those models in order to come up with the probabilistic surfaces. So here's some pretty output for Cyclone Yassi, which is the only event I've got in there at the moment because the Bureau charged me a lot of money to have those cyclone tracks. I'm showing the storm surge at different probability levels at 14 hours prior to landfall, and here we're just looking at a static mean sea level tide. So what we're interested in from a research perspective going forward is how emergency managers would apply this information and what probability threshold is appropriate. There's an extreme difficulty in validation of the probability surfaces due to the limited number of events that have caused extensive inundation. And how as the forecast progresses through time, how would decisions change? So zooming in there around the cardinal area, you can see how, as you would expect, that at a 1% probability of exceedance, that there's higher storm surge magnitudes than at the other higher probability levels. As the forecast proceeds through time, this is how the surfaces evolve. The tracks here, the green track is the best track, which is where Cyclone Yasi actually went, and the coloured track at each forecast time step was where it was forecast to go at that particular time step. So at 50 hours out, it was forecast to go somewhere close to where it did, but then at 38 hours out, it was going up somewhere near Cairns and getting a lot more kind of storm tide inundation risk mapping up at Cairns, and then gradually moving back down towards where it did impact later in the forecast. So seeing a firming up of the probability surfaces as the forecast is evolving. So this product is more a feasible concept design. It's feasible for operational use, even real-time modelling or from a precast scenario library. It needs a robust verification and raises lots of questions about how emergency managers would use such probabilistic information. So the next thing we did was take this product up to the state headquarters of emergency management of Queensland Fire and Emergency Services, invite the local district and state disaster coordinators, the police, the Department of Science and the Bureau, all to have a look and spend the day arguing about these probability levels. So it was quite fun. We got the general feedback that they accepted this interface as a proof of concept design, and recognised that it provided an early stage information for early stage mobilisation. Actually being able to visualise storm surge below these emergency managers is the first time they've been able to see where it might go when they're just been up to date, just been issued with point warnings that have no idea how that corresponds to their particular stretch of coastline. It provides a consistency of message at these local, district and state levels, because at the moment the way the state is looking at the risk from a warning is different to how the local councils are, and the state and the councils are quite antagonistic against each other and about the deployment of resources in a real-time scenario, in a real-time event. So the value of this Q-Surge product was also valued as a platform for scenario testing and for training purposes. And we found generally that the understanding of probabilities was very low across the emergency managers, and rolling out of a richer information product by the Bureau would require training. So key priorities for development of this product were identified as its extension across Queensland, improvements in inundation mapping algorithm, and improvements in spatial resolution, which all things are very possible. So to sum up, this project has successfully delivered both a functional web interface and a feasible concept design. This concept design feeds into the Bureau of Meteorology's national storm tide forecasting projects, where they're looking to improve the forecasting services across all states of Australia. It involved a unique stakeholder engagement exercise. The Bureau doesn't typically go out and ask its end users what sort of information they want. This is all very novel to them. So from our perspective here at Griffith, the research directions we're considering are looking into optimising this institutional framework for decision making and how these probabilistic design triggers are used by the stakeholders. So I've got a cast of thousands to thank for this project. It's been a long haul, so thank you very much.
Questions? Just grab the lights.
Simon.
Joanne, awesome work. I just have a question, just out of curiosity. I mean, with that look-up table approach, we have 50,000 storms. Could you elaborate a little bit on how you actually selected that matrix?
The interval spacing between the
Yeah,
cycling
we have all
parameters?
these sort of like the matrix of different parameters, and how do you actually put that into a deterministic realization of 50,000 stone? I mean, there's all these different approaches like joint probability methods.
It's not that side of the product doesn't use any probabilities. It's just selecting the maximum, so it's presenting a worst case envelope.
Okay.
Yeah. So something I'm working on with the Bureau forecasters is how to use their grey zone of uncertainty to kind of allocate probabilities across that space. I can see from Bruce Harper's modelling that he just uses like a triangular distribution or a normal distribution for the different parameters. But the forecasters don't really have any guidance on how like what parameters to select. So yeah. Yeah.
Data as well.
Yeah.
But it's a really good idea, and you can elaborate, like extend that matrix as far as you want in advance without extra computational cost and forecast models. That's good.
Yeah. So yeah, I haven't presented an extensive validation of that either. So looking into like real events crossing with that database and seeing what sort of maximum errors are getting out.
But it's a great idea, especially like as long as sort of the real-time stuff is computational prohibitive in some extent.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Other questions? Well done. Thanks very much again, Joanna.
Thank
The presentation tonight is the fourth in a series on the development of a coastal knowledge hub, and Derek will explain that, but I guess this presentation is very much a summary of where we're at in terms of this particular project. Derek is a researcher within the Centre for Coastal Management and has been working on this for 12 months?
Yeah, but yeah, 15 maybe, yeah, on and off.
About 11 months too long, I think.
Yeah.
Look, thanks very much. Second and third light.
I'll get them.
Bottom one, sir?
Bottom one as well.
Yeah.
Total darkness. That's good. All right, so my apologies if you've heard some of this before, because as Roger said, it is a summary of where we're at. But as a reward for your persistence, there is a copy, the discs are copies of the Knowledge Hub as it currently stands, which are available for you to take away. What I'm going to cover today is what is the Knowledge Hub and why do we need one, how do we develop it, what you might use it for, and what have we still got to do. And if we have time, a brief look at some of the interesting information we've gained from it. In terms of why you might need it, if you're like me, you've often wanted a quick summary of all the information on a particular process or an issue, but you've only got limited time to search it or limited money to search it out. And the abstracts, normally for papers and things, don't provide you with the degree of information that you need. It leaves you more wondering than answering any questions. Or you're not sure if you've got all the information. In the report you've got a couple of 100 pages and you really don't have the time to sift through them. So the Knowledge Hub is aimed to, or designed to overcome some of these issues for the Gold Coast. In terms of a background, over the last 60 years there's been a high degree of management intervention on the Gold Coast, and that's due to the dynamic nature of the coast, of the processes that are involved, the high degree of human intervention, and the extensive capital investment that we find in the hinterland. Since the late 1960s, the Gold Coast has a history of management decisions being based on a strong scientific knowledge. As a result, the Gold Coast is one of the most studied pieces of coast in the world, and many of the data collection and management practices involve innovative and groundbreaking techniques. But much of the knowledge that we've gained over that last 50 years is in danger of being lost, and that's due to retirement of key personnel and the changes in the institutional arrangements of the councils and government. So the City of Gold Coast and the Coastal Management Centre embarked on developing the Coastal Knowledge Hub to preserve the vital information and to make it much more accessible to the managers of the future. So that's what we were trying to do. So its purpose is, as we said there, is to ensure that the hard lessons of the past are available to guide and inform the next generation. Trying to put all that information in one place that's easily accessible for them to find, access and use. It's about transferring knowledge from the past research, the past investigations, the trials and errors that went on, to the present and to the future, so that we don't waste our resources, our time and our money on repeating what we already know and may have forgotten, and that we don't repeat the past mistakes. There are limitations to what's in the Knowledge Hub. It is about coastal processes management. It does not cover ecological, recreational or economic values. We've left those aside at this stage. This was about the physical coastal processes and the management responses to those processes. The objectives are pretty simple, and just quickly go through them to ensure that all the relevant past literature relating to the coastal processes of management is accessed and summarised. We've found over 600 papers, articles, documents that relate to that, and that's of the published literature and the grey literature from conferences, etc. It doesn't include files. We haven't gone into the correspondence files, and I'm sure there's a lot more information in those, but that task would have been far too great. It's to provide, its second objective was to provide a readily accessible database of the accepted state of the knowledge, which can be easily updated, so that if we accept that we know these things, that we don't need to argue, if it be courts of law, etc., about what is the state of the knowledge or in development applications. To provide a record of the justification, the timing, the scale and the effectiveness of the coastal management actions. And it's not just a record of what we did, but the justification of why they did it and how effective they were. And you can only do that with the advantage of time in a lot of cases, and sometimes obviously with the advantage of information or data, which is often missing. To provide coastal process information on which to base future development proposals and applications, so that we can quickly sift out what may work and what may fail. And the last two objectives, to identify the knowledge limitations in making future coastal management decisions. What do we still need to know? Where are the gaps in the knowledge? And to use that then to identify the areas where we should be targeting our future monitoring, our future investigations and our research, rather than, as I say, duplicating what we might already know. So that was the objectives of what we're trying to achieve. The project components. The first component was a reference database. As I said, there's around 630 reports, articles, papers, and we've presented them in three databases, one by key topics, one by author and one by date. And while the date mightn't be a common way to present them, it was actually the easiest way to actually assimilate the information, as you could follow things through in a chronological order as to why things were done. The key topics that we looked at, we broke into four major areas. The coastal process drivers, things about sediment and shoreline responses to those drivers, the coastal management actions, of which there's a number that we can link together into things like nourishment and boulder walls, mouth training walls, reefs, groins, those sorts of things. And then there's a miscellaneous set at the bottom, like sea level rise and data collection and planning and management, that just didn't fit anywhere else. So that's how we've sort of, the topics that we've sort of put them into, if you're looking at the database. And this is what an example of the topic database might look like, and it's really just a very simple spreadsheet sort of format at the moment in each of those 14 major topics. The first three columns are what you would normally see in a reference, being the date, the author, and all authors are listed, not just the lead authors, the titles, and the reference as to where it might be in terms of a journal or a conference, etc. The next column is a ranking, and that's a subjective ranking that the reviewers of the information have put on it. So my apologies if any of you are authors and you find very low rankings. But how we've tried to rank it is the usefulness or how relevant the information was in terms of coastal processes or management decisions. So was it data rich? Was it information rich? Then they tended to have a high ranking. If it tended to be a conference paper that then just summarised something that had been presented in a report, so it was duplicated of information from an original, then it tended to get a lower ranking. Or if it was more opinion-based, it tended to get a lower ranking rather than information-based. The multiple listings, this collection of ones is from the, as you can see, the beach nourishment sort of data. The multiple listings are what other topics does this report actually refer to. So as you can see, the 1970 DELF report, the second one there, has that information not just on nourishment, but about waves, about sediment transport, about shoreline movements, and all sorts of things. Hence, it has a very high ranking. And the database column is the library where we found it. Now, there was really 5 major libraries, or 6 major libraries that we looked at. There was the government library, which was called DERM, because it was DERM at the time we started it. The Gold Coast City Council Library, their engineering assets library. There is also the Centre of Coastal Management Library, the TRESP online resources, and the Department of Lands in New South Wales resources. And then there are some subtopics. So you should be able to follow a reference, find a reference if you were looking by topic, find where it is, what else it's about, etc. The colour codings relate to where we've got to with the reviews of it. So the green ones are ones where we have someone has reviewed them as part of the Knowledge Hub project, and then that review has been looked at by myself as the lead of the project, and said, yep, that review is reasonably good. It presents all the major information that we would want, and the ranking is reasonably relevant. The yellow one, the yellow colour coding, means that it has been reviewed by someone else, but I haven't actually had the chance in the last 15 months to actually look at it. The brown ones are reports that we know are there, but we have not actually got round to reviewing. And the blue ones are reports that we know that are there, but we can't find them. Or in the case of the New South Wales Public Lands Library, we didn't have access to them. All right? So we have reviewed over 300 of the 600, and there is annotations for them. There's about another 200 that we've still to do, and there's around just under 100 that we can't have access to or can't get access to. They're just missing. They're referred to, but they're missing. The second component is the annotated bibliographies. Now this, there's about 300 reports, as I've said, that were reviewed and were summarised, and it's more than just an abstract, because often an abstract, if it's a conference paper, as you know from writing them, you write the abstract well in advance of writing the paper, and it may not actually refer to what you've actually found in the end. And the abstracts of major reports are quite brief compared to the amount of information in them. So what we've done is annotated them. Each annotation includes the source, the library where you might find it, the reviewer who looked at it and what ranking they provided to it, so you know who to blame if it's your report, a brief summary, a 1 or 2 paragraph sort of look at that report, which is similar to an abstract, but then it has a summary of the key points and findings. And how much is in there really depends on the report. For example, the DELF report comes down to 5 pages of key points and findings from something like a 140-page report that was pretty critical to what was to happen in management of the Gold Coast over the next 30 years. And then we present we present any key figures and tables from the report and major conclusions. Now the key points and findings are in bullet point. They are a concise summary of the major information. Now the advantage of the annotations is that we are not confined, because they're our interpretation, we're not confined by copyright. On the disc we cannot give you all of the reports, even though we have 90% or the 500 of them all scanned. We can't give a lot of that information on, or those reports on, because of copyright or duplication or sensitivity of information. What we can give on is our interpretation of them as annotations. So if it's topics that you wanted to look at or reports that you wanted to look at and there's an annotation done, you can use that information without having to go to the actual primary source. If you wanted to go to the primary source, there's enough information there through the library of where we got it from to go to those gatekeepers to get it. But we are not allowed to give you the scans of all the reports, unfortunately. So that's what's in the annotations. The other components was a workshop with experts and long-serving professionals that we sat down with 15 of them and talked about the Knowledge Hub, what should go into it, what shouldn't, what use it is, those sorts of things. Their conclusion at the end of that day was this was a very useful product and that it will aid ongoing coastal management at a time when we're starting to lose information greatly for the Gold Coast. So they fully endorsed the product. We've done the presentations, as Roger said. This is the fourth one to professionals and stakeholders. The other three covered various aspects, and some of this is a summary of the various parts of that. And that was one of the deliverables. Still to be done then is the last 3 points. The literature reviews of the coastal processes and management. For each of those key topics, we wanted to summarise all the information in like a literature review that allowed you to read the information about it in a condensed version and follow chronologically what has changed within those processes or how information has been updated and what is the actual state of the knowledge. Now we're still doing that. We haven't managed to complete those, and they'll be in the next release of the Coastal Knowledge Hub will be those summaries along with around about 100 more annotations. All right, we won't annotate all of the remaining reports because we sort of ranked which ones we needed to do, and there's probably 100 odd that we probably don't need to because they're duplications. So that's the second level of the second release of the Knowledge Hub will include those things. Access to the Knowledge Hub. So at the moment on the disk you have the databases, you have the annotations in there. The access will come to the summaries, etc. There is consideration to make it a web-based interface, either through the GCCM or the City Council website, and that's work that hopefully will go on this year to actually develop that into an inquiry tool that will be able to be used and be much more available for access. And then there is one of the other deliverables is to produce some journal articles summarising some of the things that we've found, the interesting stuff that we've found out of the Knowledge Hub. In terms of what the information is about, oh, that was fancy. We're looking at a slightly different set of central themes to give you some idea of the spread of information. There's around 105 or around 20% of the information, or just under 20%, is on coastal process drivers. Around the same number of reports on erosion and sediment budgets. Larger amount of work on mouth training and bypassing. A lot of information around Tweed and Narang, particularly when those projects were firing up. Also, over 120 of those 180 articles are about those. Around 100 odd references about beach nourishment projects and their success or effects. Around 125 on things like the A-line wall, the groins, the southern area groins, and other coastal protection structures and their success and effects. And then there's 90 that cover general topics. So there is a range of information. It's not concentrated in one particular area of process or one particular area of management. And I think there's a reasonably good spread of the things that have been going on the Gold Coast. Slightly different if we looked at it by geographical location. On the right is their reference by area, and around 50% of the reports cover more than one area of the Gold Coast. And there are things like on waves, they might be on walls, that sort of type of stuff rather than particular area, so there's 50% do that. About 20% really concentrate on the Tweed. Another 14% in the southern area around the Coolangatta Kura sort of area with the effects of the Tweed and around the Kura Point groin. most of those, or around Kura renourishments. And the same with the northern area, around the same number up there, dealing with narrow neck in particular and the seaway. But we can see a real shortage of information, a real lack of information around the centre part of the coast. Only 5% of our published and grey literature is around that part of the coast. And that's something we didn't expect to find. And if we look at it by suburb, looking at the ones that aren't the whole coast, but the ones that refer particularly to just different areas, we can see that Miami and Nobbies actually have nothing. There is no reports in particular about them, the processes there, or the shoreline responses there. All right, so we have a lack of information about those areas. A lot, as we said, at Kura and Coolangatta, a lot at Narrow Neck in relation to the interventions that have gone there, but a very, very limited number in around that central part. If we looked at the timeline of when information came on stream or become available in terms of the Gold Coast, there was 3 reports in pre the 60s, including the first one really about storms, etc. in the Gold Coast in 1951 after the cyclones of 1950. The 1960s, growing concern about erosion, the 67 storm events have along, but still not a huge number of reports written. The 1970s started with the Delft report and the implementation of the recommendations in the Delft report, and we ended up with a lot more research being done, a lot more reporting of what was being done, and so that decade we have around 70 odd, okay, around about 7 odd reports a year. The 1980s, we peaked in terms of the amount of information that was being published or produced about Gold Coast beaches, and then a slight decline as we go back through the 90s and 2000s, but still a lot of information, around 14 odd reports or documents or papers presented per year. And even when we go through to, well, in the 2000s, we had the starting of the Centre of Coastal Management. We had in 2008 the Shoreline Management Plan, and then most of the reports that have happened since then, through into the 2010s, which is only 3.5 years old, we've had a lot of reports about the implementation of the Shoreline Management Plan, mostly being produced by the Centre. Right, so there is still a lot of information out there and being produced on what's happening on Gold Coast beaches. Right, it's an ongoing situation of research and investigation. Now this is some of the information that we sort of looked at, or some of the interesting things that we've looked at. And this one relates to storms. One of the things we've done is put all the information, is that wrong? No? Is that all the information together from all the multiple sources about storms, and put them together and looked at what you might get out of it. All right, and some real sort of quite basic sort of interpretation. And this presents storm frequency in years from the 1870s through to 2013. All right, and the first thing that jumps out at you is that it appears to be a real change in the frequency of storms. Okay, but what that really reflects is a change in the way that the information is collected and how it's reported. The early information up to the 1970s is from anecdotal records, and we have an average of around about 2 storms, whether they be tropical cyclones or east coast lows, and reported around about 2 a year. Since 1970, when it's wave-based, wave buoy-based, then we go up to around about 7.5 storms a year, and the criteria for a storm through that period comes from work by from Callahan and Allen in 2000, when they termed a storm to be above a 3.5 metre significant wave height at Brisbane. And so we can see that if we tried to compare the 2 records, we can't really. But we can do things. It's not doing what it's. Oh, there we go. But we can look at changes from the mean. The blue is the actual number of storms. The brown is a running mean, because it's the antecedent conditions in a beach that then lead to damage, rather than just the number of storms. So it's what's happened in the years preceding that's become important as well. And we can see that there is definite spikes in it. The 1890s, as Jonas said, when jumping pin, the cyclones of the 1890s produced the jumping pin split. The cyclones of the 1950s that affected Main Beach and Narrow Neck and led to breaches and that split. The 1960 storms, we can see the 1967, 10 events above the criteria, all right, which was within 6 months was a huge storms and series. Then through into the 1970s, in 1972 and 74 cyclones, where again we ran cyclones together. The 1980s, smaller spike in the 1990s. And we can look at what the responses to the beaches have been to those spikes. And that spiking or increased frequency is really important in how our beach responds. Just as importantly are the troughs and storms. So we had this huge trough through the 1910s to 1930s when we had very, very few storms. So longshore transport was not really initiated. Headland bypassing around places like Burleigh and Curra, and probably around Point Danger, weren't really initiated to a high degree. So we were going to have a lack of sediment coming into the Gold Coast in the years following that. And then if we follow those lags in storms to spikes in storms, which increase cross-shore transport and longshore transport, we can see why we get problems. And we can see the other little troughs, smaller ones through the 80s, 90s and early 2000s. So it's this frequency of storms that become important, and we can only look at that over the longest possible record when we put all of the data sources together. Looking at any one piece of information doesn't give us that. So that's something that the Knowledge Hub is able to do. We can look at, as well as the frequency of storms, it is the duration and energy within the storms. So these are 3 years, or 3 years when we've had more than 3 storms within a month. So the blue one is January 1967, and we can see the 3 storms, November 1998, and August, September 2008. And we can see the storm criteria from Callaghan and Allen coming through at the 3.5 metres. So that if we just looked at frequency, we can say, oh yeah, they were all the same. They were all the same amount of storminess, therefore we should have the same amount of effect. But if we look at the duration and intensity of the storms, then they're quite different. And therefore we can see why June 1967, which was actually on the back of about 5 preceding cyclonic and East Coast low events, why we had such a large degree of erosion, and it took out such things as the Esplanade at Surfers Paradise, compared to the same frequency for August, September 2008, where they barely just got over the criteria. So again, this is the sort of information that we're starting to pick up in the Knowledge Hub to try and present different sorts of analysis that may not have been able to be done by only looking at small time periods or discrete information. The second interesting thing that we've done with the Knowledge Hub is look at changes in calculated longshore sediment transport rates over time, and how those calculations have changed and how they have precursored management decisions. So this is the Delft 1970s, pre-1960s or pre the Tweed Walls sediment budget that you can build up from their report, and we can see nearly 500,000 coming around Point Danger, a lot less at Burleigh, so therefore we had losses, all right, and what it was assumed to be in the Delft report, that those losses were going to offshore because the beach wasn't building up, and so the change in the longshore transport potential, if it wasn't on the beach, it must be somewhere, so they said it was offshore. Then this increase in longshore sediment transport between Burleigh as we go towards Nerang, therefore to feed that potential we must have longshore erosion. And it was on the basis of this sort of argument that the figures for the amount of nourishment that is required for Gold Coast beaches was based. It was saying that we have to deal with storm events, but we also have to deal with long-term losses and long-term erosion in the range of 0.3 metres a year if we're looking at it as a horizontal movement. So that's what the 1970s information gave us. If we look at what Delft then came back in 1992 in their post-Tweed walls, and this follows some work that the Beach Protection Authority started doing in the 80s and started questioning those Delft figures. And as I say, those Delft figures were what we were basing shoreline management basically on. We get these figures, and now the Tweed walls are in place, and this is before TRESP, so that we can see we have our 500 arriving down at Point Danger, not much different from the pre-wall situation, but only around 128,000 going past by natural bypassing. And that figure changes because as the ebb tide bar redeveloped at Tweed, it took this amount was going up and up, but this is what the figure by 1992 should have been. Key consideration though then is that we will have erosion on the downstream side, and we saw that. Post-TRESP, large amounts of erosion at Coolangatta and Kura, which led to the Kura Point groin, which Dave Robinson will tell you all about and told us about last time I spoke. And a large amount of erosion there. But we see another big change when we get up to Currumbin. The rates of transport are almost back only 100,000 less than what they were at Point Danger. So then it's only 100,000 difference up to the seaway. So this longshore transport gradient doesn't have to be fed, so therefore there isn't the evidence that we've got long-term erosion. Therefore there isn't the need for the same amount of renourishment that we might have done to feed that. So from this, we can change what was predicted or what was forecast to be needed in terms of beach nourishment from reworking longshore transport. Then if we look at what the recent literature, by cobbling together all sorts of recent literature in the Knowledge Hub between 2007 and 2012, various little reports, none that deal totally with sediment transport over the whole coast, we get this sort of pattern. Again, similar figures arriving at Point Danger, slightly more. We can see 33,000 coming past with the dredging on average. We can see 484,000, 100,000 coming past with the TRESP bypass, and our natural bypassing is now at around 40. Right, it seems to be that the bar is stabilised to some degree. We've got some accretion going in at Coolangatta and Kura. We've got a huge amount now transporting through Currumbin and through Burleigh. And we've got increased amounts going past at the seaway, which means that pumping rates are higher than what were predicted. So the costs of doing that are higher. The amount that's actually arriving on South Australia is higher than what the forecasts were. And again, that may have consequences to what our ongoing management in the next 5 to 10 years of the coast is. So again, this is a use of the Coastal Knowledge Hub to try and put together a longer look at what we've changed in terms of transport and therefore the implications for management. And the last one that I'll give you a quick rundown on, and again my apologies to anyone that was here last time because this is a repeat, is what's happened with shoreline management responses, and in particularly in the walls, etc. And the management responses were pretty typical for what was going on shorelines, eroding shorelines or shorelines that had storm effects in the 1920s. Timber seawalls at Narrow Neck. 1936 we had a cyclone, we had responses of timber walls at Kura, Currumbin and Coolangatta. 1938, interestingly, a very early reference to building relocations at Main Beach in South Stradbroke Island. Retreat from coastal erosion areas is nothing new on the Gold Coast. Early 70s, we had rock walls at Narrow Neck. The wooden structures there are the early ones at Narrow Neck. The 1950s, we had rock walls at Narrow Neck and at Main Beach, as we can see here. After cyclonic erosion in the 1950s, 51 and 54, we needed to hard protect what was then the Pacific Highway. Right. We had further beaches, further walls going on at Burleigh and Currumbin. We had a situation that coastal management was spread over many government departments. and there seemed to be little effort to resolve issues, and the literature written around the time says that and suggests that that was counterproductive for dealing with problems in the Gold Coast. And the literature report, when 1959, when the Gold Coast City Council became into being, from the amalgamation of Albertshire and Gold Coast, they inherited those problems. So it's probably not fair to say that the Gold Coast City Council invented the problems, they inherited a fair number of them. But that was a reasonably typical management response in that time. The 1960s, there became the need for a coordinated management approach. And the catalysts for that were really what was happening on the coast. The Tweed training walls were extended from 62 to 64. But as you can see from the dates, even prior to that, the Coordinator's General Department was aware that there was potential problems. In 1961, they were aware of it. There's reports pointing that out. They sent some of their officers overseas to look at what overseas responses were, and those responses were about nourishment, etc., in America and in Holland. In 1964, just as the wars were being finished, they commissioned Delft to examine the problems. So they weren't waiting till we had the massive problems of the 70s. They were actually being proactive to those sort of potential problems. In 1965, Delft recommended a comprehensive investigations program and the establishment of the Beach Protection Authority, and those things were followed through, that the Beach Protection Authority actually came from the recommendations based on what was happening here in the Gold Coast. Is that a fair assessment, Dave? Yeah, good. The second catalyst was the significant erosion damage that occurred in the 7 tropical cyclones and east coast lows in the first 6 months of 1967. So there was a framework in place to do investigation. It had only just started. There was aware that there was going to be problems because of Tweed. Then we got hit with these 7 storms within 6 months, which is a huge storms in series. Right? And we know what the effects are. Here's the surfers Esplanade. Picture here of what remains of it, and the army and various other volunteers sandbagging the base of it. Right, so that was a catalyst then to get in and do lots of investigation. The Delft report came out of that, and the recommendations of how we did coastal management on the Gold Coast for the next 30 years really flowed out of that. So they were the catalysts that we needed a coordinated approach. And this sort of sets out the range of coordinated approach that come from both government departments, the Beach Protection Authority or the Coordinator's General Department, and the City Council. And so on the far left we can see the storm events, but then we can see there was a range of planning responses about an A-line wall, about beach erosion control districts, about building foundations, all right? Codes of practices, policies, etc. that come out of them. There was a series of structures constructed. We come up with a seawall design. Before that there wasn't a design. We came up with, there was a lot of building of boulder walls, 3K of boulder walls in 1968. Curra Point groin in 1972. The Currumbin training walls. A second groin at Curra. Tallabudgera training walls. And the groins at Palm Beach all come in that period up to the 1980s. And we started beach nourishment. Beach nourishment was the preferred response to erosion by Delft. It took the cyclones through from 72 to 74 before there was action. Right, action, then we jumped in with 1.3 million cubic metres occurring at surface, 0.9 million at Curra, and we started pumping from Currumbin into Palm Beach. And the start was 0.25 million in relation to the Currumbin training wall. And so nourishment started then. So we can trace what our responses were to what the drivers were. But the key thing was that there started to be coordination. It wasn't departments fighting each other or the city fighting the departments. All right, it took a fair bit. I wouldn't say it was easy. For example, the agreement on the alignment of the A-line boulder wall took something like about 8 years to arrive at. I've stolen this one from Angus. This shows us how the protection in the walls have changed from timber, as we said in the 1920s, through to rock riprap, clay shale, through the 40s and 60s. Note the sandbagging emergent responses in the 60s, same sandbagging emergent responses in 2013 to Oswald. And then in this design walls through really from the 60s through to the 2010s. All right. I should point out, I meant to point out that when we're talking about the reports and number of reports, a lot of the early reports, when we started reading this, we started with the earliest reports, and most of them came from what was called the City Council Beach Replenishment Program, where the engineer at the time, Sam Smith, very wisely documented almost everything. And there was something like 170 of those reports that are relevant, and he was the author or co-author of 127 of them. Angus was the co-author of 86 of them, or author of 86 of them, between the 1980s and 2000, but he gets pipped on the list of people that have authored or co-authored reports on the Gold Coast by Roger, who's about 108. So there you go, that's the gold, silver and bronze medal writers of Gold Coast coastal processes and management. All right. So we've got this sort of responses, and a lot of this comes out of a seawall review project that has been going on as part of the 3-point plan and in recent times, but a lot of the information is encapsulated into the Coastal Knowledge Hub. And finally, the last thing we looked at was beach nourishment. Where has it gone? What's it done? And trying to investigate its effectiveness. Okay, so what we have is a huge spreadsheet of all the nourishment, of all the volumes of where it's come from, where it's gone to, etc. And then we can tie that hopefully somewhere with data on beach change or nearshore change to see what effects it might have. But they are future projects. But to give you some idea what happened, the 1970s, as I said, 74, after the 72 and 74.